record these sessions, and we'll begin. So let me open with a prayer, please, today. So, Father, I thank you for those individuals, families, and ministries represented by those who are paying attention today. I pray that you bless us all with a sense of your presence and guidance as we deal with a very significant topic in terms of church health. So we just ask for your help today. Amen. I'm Dr. Paul VanValin. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I'm the founder of Eden Leaders Institute. And the purpose of Eden Leaders Institute is to help leaders establish healthy families, dynamic communities, and meaningful legacies. So we're looking at the individual, the family, the organizations, and the future as we mentor younger leaders. And we have done a series of presentations once a month. I think we skipped one or two because of holidays or busy times in the summer. And the sequence has been deriving from John 10, the Good Shepherd being the metaphor. And the last two sessions were on normal personality. So we established an understanding of how to think about, look at, measure different normal personality types, none of which are bad, and how it affects communication, understanding, motivation. And we tied it into the organization with selection, training, and motivation as being critical principles of good leadership. So due to my neglectfulness, the last training has not yet been loaded up onto the website. But when we get to the end, I'll show you the resources that are useful for both this topic and others pertaining to recent topics, including my own training. And we've built a new website called EdenLeaders.com, which is still just barely up, and we'll be putting all of the trainings there at that website. And so you'll be able to download at your convenience, share them with others. So that's happening. The topic today has to do with abnormal personalities, and that's a statistical term and a functional term. So we're going to talk about different kinds of people that make it very difficult for the leader and for the congregation in terms of, or business administration if you're in business, just in terms of the way they're both wired, developmentally, how they think and how they tend to behave, and some of the challenges and some of the ways of dealing with these challenges. So that's what we're about today. And I need to figure out how to move the slide. So I'm going to share a few scriptures. I'm a psychologist with a long generations of ministry behind me. So looking at Scripture, the truth from Scripture, the traditions of the Christian faith, and the science associated with understanding human behavior are what I do. So we're going to start just looking at Scripture and how some biblical terms that relate to negative influences from within and without the church. So these robbers and shepherds here in John 10. So I'm just going to read aloud. We're just kind of going to go through this. Very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd, and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. So we have the introduction of thieves and wolves. We also have this concept of stumbling. And it's referenced several times. We'll look at several references. And to stumble, and this is out of a dictionary, to make a slip, mistake, or blunder, especially a sinful one. And that's why I chose this definition. It references the biblical use of stumbling. To stumble over a question, to stumble and fall from grace. That's how we're using it here. So 1 John 2:10, anyone who loves their brother and sister lives in the light, and there is nothing in them to make them stumble. So we start positively, that if we are full of love, living in the light, which covers, I'm sorry, I have allergies here in Virginia. It's allergy season. The leaves are starting to fall. I have a cough drop in. And this, the way my symptoms manifest themselves is I cough when I talk, which is what I do all day. So I buy cough drops by the 130 number in the bag thing. So I apologize for that. That's something I have to cope with, and so do you. So loving our brothers and sisters while living in the light, living an enlightened life, not one that's driven by the flesh, which is the natural wiring, or by the subconscious or unmet needs or woundedness or whatever. There is nothing in those individuals to cause others to stumble. So that's a great hopeful statement. But there are people who cause others to stumble and who stumble themselves. If anyone causes one of these little ones, which can be used metaphorically, he was talking about children, but I think it's a metaphor for any young, not fully developing human being. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, he's talking about, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to stumble. Such things must come. In other words, this is a statement to us. This isn't going to go away. This reality that there are people that cause others to stumble. But woe to the person through whom they come. And so we are going to be dealing with people who are woeful in this presentation today. It's referenced in Matthew 18:7. Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to stumble, but such things must come. But woe to the person through whom they come. And I don't know why I repeated that, but I did. And this text is repeated twice more, basically, in the New Testament. 2 Timothy. So we have Christ talking about these things. We have Paul talking about, using different terms, but some of these same things. But mark this: there will be terrible times in the last days. So the phrase here, people will be lovers of other than God. That's the point. Lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, and abusive. Disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. So they can look like godly people, have nothing to do with such people. So you're going to see how this text in particular, I'm going to back up a little bit, directly relates to action that sometimes has to be taken with people who are unwilling or unable to function in a loving fashion within the body of the church. So these phrases really, you'll see parallel when I give you diagnostic criterion for people who science calls different than others. Lovers of themselves. We're going to talk about the narcissist. Lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive. Also characteristics of narcissists and or antisocial personalities, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy. You'll see how these phrases fit certain kinds of people, certain personalities. So they are the kind who worm their way into homes, and now we get specific as to problems they can cause, and gain control over gullible women who are loaded down with sins and swayed by all kinds of evil desires. So this is a particularly common problem because it's listed specifically. And those are relational problems between, in this case, it would be mostly men who are seen as the influencers of women who are vulnerable. Always learning but never able to come to knowledge of the truth. Just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so also these teachers, now see, he's referencing leaders now. So he's throwing in some leader people. They are men of depraved minds who, as far as the faith is concerned, are rejected. But they will not get very far because, as in the case of those men, their folly will be clear to everyone. And what we want to come from this discussion is the ability to identify those individuals who need to be seen as either foolish or potentially even bordering into the side of being evil in their intent. So these are the categories, biblical terminology: thieves and wolves, those who cause stumbling, terrible people who are depraved and cause great harm. These are some of the biblical terms. So what are they in terms of contemporary terms, in terms of terms you may see, in the news, in the newspaper, if you choose to research online and so forth. So it's a term not unique to me: predators. People who have developed the ability to find those, in biblical terms, gullible people, not just women. Our society is different now. It's broadened out. Predators can be women. And so these are people who tend to gain a position of manipulation. They are seeking to pursue their own interests at the cost of others. And an abuse may be a form of that expression. But unfortunately, it often is in a sexual way, uh, bribery, distortion, monetary way kind of things. And given what I do and how long I've been doing it and the relationships I have with churches and leaders, I've seen and heard and experienced and been involved with some stories that are really, really bad, really bad. And I'm going to share some of them with you. They will, none of them will contain any reference to anyone who exists in my local community now, highly unlikely to be identified. Um, but for example, predators can exist in the leadership of the church. And one of the things we have to overcome is our own denial, our own ability to not see evidence that bad things are happening. And so, unfortunately, in our community, and actually, this one you may recognize if you live in our area because it was so newsworthy. Several years ago, we had a local pastor who was arrested because of engagement with inappropriate activity with minors, and he was a pastor. And in fact, his history, this particular individual's history, was years as a youth leader, and the community was shocked and horrified to learn that the behavior that he had manifest had been for a number of years, involving many, unfortunately, many young people. So, so that's an example of someone who used position to meet selfish need and violated individuals, causing nothing is irreparable. But I'm using the term just to illustrate the magnitude of the problem it causes in the life when there is leadership abuse. So, but it's also can be women, and the case I'm thinking of occurred a number of years ago, where a woman on staff, large church, multi-staff church, and we don't know the specifics, but something inappropriate developed with one of the other staff members, resulting in people leaving position, including this woman. But what sometimes happens, because we're a large, pluralistic society, you can go different places. You can. My understanding was she was rehired, and the reason I call it predator, the story as best I could learn, was she was the initiator, and then later we learned there was a history of this kind of initiation, and yet when she was hired, and she was very competent in her role on the job. When she was left this area to go to another area, she was hired into a similar position into a large multi-team church. And so failure to ask questions, failure to check references. Again, she was very competent in her role. So just a couple examples of predators as leaders, but you can also have predators from within the congregation, often people seeking leadership or influence, which is why churches that are in partnership with Eden Leaders Institute here in Virginia Beach and Norfolk have, and most of the more large sophisticated churches, background checks, doing what we can to weed out individuals from positions where they could harm children or adolescents or other vulnerable populations. So in our culture, we have to take steps to do what we can to identify people who, at least in their history, have caused problems. So those are predators. And they could have come from any, that's just a really broad categorization of the behavior. It doesn't really describe their motivation and so forth. So I want to talk about personality disorders, which is a technical term that we use. So I'm going to show you some criterion that make up these specific disorders. And disorder means that there's something wrong. So here's a phrase from the DSM-5 manual, which defines this thing. It's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and they edit it every couple of years. So personality disorders are associated with ways of thinking and feeling about oneself and others that significantly and adversely affect how an individual functions in many aspects of life. These are chronic situations. They have to have gone on for at least 2 years. The nature of the diagnosis suggests that it's lifelong, very difficult to change, and you'll see why as I go into this, and causing problems in multiple arenas of life. And so I gave you the the website, and it's so long because it's in its entirety. So that if you choose to want to go read the document from which this quote comes, it's a nice short document, and there are others that look into this in more detail than we can present here. But that's the definition of personality disorders: pervasive, lifelong, in most cases, causing significant problems in significant populations of people. So that's what we have going on there. Now, so you're going to see a list of 10 different personality disorders, and what they have in common are these four components. And then you will see how they differ from each other. So they're distorted thinking patterns. They actually think differently. When I'm working with, I evaluate a lot of little children. And the most common problem that little children are brought in for psychological evaluation is they just misbehave. They seem angry when you tell them to do stuff. They have a propensity for disobedience. They're willing to raise a ruckus to protest what they perceive to be the unjust treatment of adults imposing their will on them. And I have to tell parents, and I give them a book to read that describes this. Your child thinks differently than other children. So let's say I'm dealing with a 6-year-old. The term we use is oppositional. You have an oppositional child. They're opposing adults. I'll say to the parent, little Johnny here is really oppositional. He thinks differently than other kids. If you ask little Johnny what he's supposed to do, he can tell you. So if you say, what are you supposed to do when the teacher gives you an instruction, he'll say, well, you're supposed to do what the teacher says. But if we were to ask him, what do you believe is the right thing to do? Little Johnny would say, well, I think I should do what I want to do. So if the teacher tells me something I want to do, I think I should be able to do it. But if the teacher tells me something I don't want to do, I shouldn't do it. You ask any other child in the classroom, and they believe that what they should do is what the teacher tells them to do. But these children believe differently. These children grow into adults who believe differently. They have problematic emotional responses. They're not well regulated. They express emotion in the extreme. They are over or under regulated impulse control. And so impulse control has to do with, you have a thought, you have the ability to analyze that thought, good, bad, what's the future outcome, and make a choice. If you are an impulsive person, you just act. Thought, act, and the consequences are not always good. If you do everything you think, you'll be in trouble. And it results in interpersonal difficulties. Now, the interesting thing about personality disorders, they often don't think they have a problem. And you'll see this referenced as we go through. So this may be getting a little academic, but for some of you, it sort of makes sense as to how we organize these things to understand them. And my goal here is that, not that you become an expert in diagnosis or something, but that we talk about this enough, and you can review this material if you choose to later, to where if you see a pattern, you're able to say, okay, I wonder if that relates here. Seek a little consultation and maybe avoid a lot of future hassle. So 3 clusters, and these are the terms that are used to describe them: the odd or eccentric individuals. And so we have 3 types: paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal. I'll give you descriptors. But if you're familiar with the term schizophrenia, you'll see the same prefix in 2 of these words, and it does have to do with thought and perception. Paranoid, most people, we use that in common language. A paranoid person, distrusting, suspicious. And so these 3 things all have to do with misperception. And the vast majority are not dangerous people unless a paranoid person starts acting out defensively. But they are definitely odd. They don't fit in. In fact, now the schizoid personality also may have an autistic diagnosis as well, fit on the autism spectrum. So cluster A, odd, eccentric. Cluster B, dramatic, emotional, and erratic. Big emotions, not always lined up with what other people say are reasonable responses. Very difficult to control, very impulsive. Here you have the borderline personality disorder, the narcissistic, and that's a word that we're hearing a lot about with our social media culture. Narcissistic, histrionic, and antisocial. And the antisocial is what it seems to be. They're opposing. They're not in line with society's values and rules. Histrionic has to do with huge dramatic expression. Narcissistic, self-focused, and borderline, a mix of a variety of emotions. I'll elaborate in just a minute. Cluster C, the anxious, fearful, more anxiety-driven. So the avoidant personality is just the way it sounds. Avoids social contexts in which they feel uncomfortable. The dependent person seeks someone else to care for them, and the obsessive-compulsive person is, you've heard that term too. They have different than obsessive-compulsive disorder. in which a person feels a lot of anxiety, understands they have a condition that needs help. It's treatable, and the obsessive compulsive personality disorder is more likely to blame others for their need to be in control of circumstances. So it's a different angle. We'll elaborate on that. So we take the 10, we divide them into 3 clusters, and now we'll look briefly at each cluster. So paranoid, suspicious, distrustful. And here's where it affects a congregation. They cannot forgive. They'll be very accusatory, very, very demanding, and just when you interact with them, it's like their thinking's not right, and you can't get it right. You try to rationalize with them, they just don't get it. They perceive, harm. You don't really care for me. You planned this and that, and fortunately, these are not that common. So if you could go your whole career and maybe not come across somebody, but they really stand out if you do have someone like this within your sphere of influence. The schizoid is more of a loner, more aloof, not a lot of emotion. They seem kind of flat, kind of keep to themselves. They may choose a career path of computer stuff, more things related, not people, engineering. And so all of these personality types may be intelligent people. They may have great gifts and talents, but in the social world, there are some significant problems. Schizotypal actually has sensory perceptual problems. They will actually not see things right, hear things right. They may have some minor hallucination kind of experiences. And genetically, research shows a link genetically with previous generations who have schizophrenia. So it's that kind of thing where their brains just don't process things the same. Again, they kind of appear odd, different. They don't process social cues right. And some of them also now fall on the autism spectrum to continue. So we move from the kind of odd eccentric to the dramatic emotional erratic. The antisocial personality often goes to prison. There are many, many clever people, and they can kind of move their impulses into like legal means. They could be salespeople, but they're likely to be kind of unscrupulous. They can become managers, and they're likely to be manipulative. I had a friend. This is my first exposure to this, at least that comes to mind. I was in graduate school, and my world had been pretty sheltered. I grew up in a middle class environment in an area where there weren't a lot of gangs, there wasn't a lot of really significant danger, and got into graduate school, and there was a fellow student who had a good friend, and the good friend said, "Now you need to watch Bill. He'll steal from you." What? Oh yeah, don't be leaving your wallet lying around. And I said, so how does that work? I mean, you're his friend? Oh yeah, I'm his friend, and I don't leave my wallet lying around. And so this really hit me that, okay, here's somebody, a known thief, in a graduate program, going to work with people. So I couldn't quite put it all together, but his friend just accepted it, protected himself, and enjoyed other aspects of his relationship with his friend. So that's an antisocial personality who thus far had been able to proceed, and so apparently he had never been arrested or gone to jail or something like that. So that's antisocial. Histrionic is just very dramatic, very attention-seeking. They seek to be the center of attention and will exhort to negative ways to get it. And so they will. The way they're disruptive in a congregation is just how much time and attention they will seek and can elicit through very dramatic means: complaints, fainting, aches and pains, and they really lack insight into a psychological motive for their various experiences. The narcissistic person I wanted to talk about a bit. When I've been working with church boards and pastors or business boards, the narcissistic individual often has been part of the problem. Narcissists are very self-focused. They believe that they are right, and they believe that other people should see that they are right, and they believe that other people should want to serve them. It's an interesting mix. Everybody has a slight tendency toward that in the basic nature of mankind, in that we want to be God. That's a basic struggle that all the way back to Adam and Eve. But the narcissistic personality is out there with this. And so I have a relative that was a clear narcissist. He initially was very, when you first met him, engaging, funny, entertaining, but after being with him a while, you began to realize it's always about him. These stories are always about him. They start getting repetitive. He's always presenting, and he was a talented, brilliant individual, so he did have accomplishments and so on. But over the years, you kept hearing and you realized he's all about him. That's what he's about. And you begin looking at the relationships he had with others, and the criticalness he had of others, and lack of empathy, and you realize this person's narcissistic. And he both did great things. He was a pastor, this person I'm talking about, but he also hurt some people pretty badly as he selfishly pursued his own gain. So the narcissist, the way that they think is they really believe that everything should be about them, but they manifest it very differently than the histrionic. They don't dramatically seize the moment with complaints, dramatic expressions of emotion. They just demand things, and they don't mind hurting other people to get their needs met. And so, you've heard us talk about, not us, me, but social media and how we have a narcissistic culture and people are all about themselves. I think we're going to see an increase in narcissistic personality disorder. And these people really have difficulty with empathy. They really don't feel it. And so intervening with them, there are some things we can do to help people develop empathy if they want to, but that's a real problem. They don't really want to. And so if you have a board of or some group of leaders and you have a person who's narcissistic, it's really difficult to get them to follow the mission or the vision in the way others do. They will have their own ideas. This is a true story. It was a church of about 350, a decent sized church in a rural area in one of the central states, and an individual just got it into his head that the church should have particular signage. And it just was some simple thing he thought, had to do with some evangelistic slogan that he'd concocted. And he just believed that's what they should do. And for 2 years, he campaigned and became a real thorn in the side of the pastor until he finally left. And he left angrily and bitterly, saying things that were mean and nasty about how this church really didn't love the lost and so on, all out of his narcissism. He had an idea, therefore it should happen, you should do what I tell you. And it really caused a lot of grief until he left, and then that actually helped the situation. Borderline personality disorders. I don't use this term because it's almost in my field derogatory. I mean, the others all sound judgmental too, but this one in particular, for decades, it wasn't believed to be treatable or responsive to any form of treatment. And the intensity of the moods and the intensity of the behaviors with frequent self-harm, suicidal gestures, this is the kind of situation where you may know somebody that's dated someone like this, and the threat of abandonment creates these really dramatic gestures. So you'll hear a person say, I want to break up, but I'm afraid to leave. They just say he says he'll kill himself if I leave. And so it is perceived as very manipulative, very controlling through intense things. They tend to see things in black and white, and they can switch. So there's this concept that they can idealize and vilify the same person in the same day, depending on circumstances. So this love-hate phenomenon is on steroids. We're just really magnified with these folks. So this is cluster B. Cluster C, the anxious, fearful. Avoidance are not going to cause you much trouble. They're just not going to take much attention at all. They're just anxious. They're kind of we use metaphors like shrinking violet, wallflower. They're just kind of there. They are experiencing a lot of discomfort. They need help and encouragement, and they can respond to some treatment. Learning to be assertive, learning to express their feelings, learning to trust that others will not reject them. So there's some help for them, and they're actually not going to cause you much problem. Nor will the dependents accept if one latches onto you and wants all of your time and attention. And they're not particularly manipulative. They're just needy. And so they have difficulty making decisions. They'll be always seeking your advice. You may actually feel sort of honored or something positive that someone looks up to you so much. And so this is one of those situations the leader has to realize this isn't going to change, and I really can't afford to be a parent figure. And then we work to find other ways to meet their needs. But they're really not that much trouble if you identify this and you can kind of set some boundaries. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder can also be problematic. They tend to think that they're really rigid with rules, and so they they tend to love backgrounds like I had. I come from a holiness tradition, lots of defining do's and don'ts. These would be the kind of typical Pharisaical kinds of people, just loving the rules, but lording over others, being very judgmental, lacking empathy. And so, like, to have a spouse who is obsessive compulsive disorder, I'm contrasting these two. You're dealing with someone who's anxious, who's miserable. You want to help them. You want to help them get over this. But if they are a obsessive compulsive personality, they're likely to be angry and demanding. Now, anxiety, they're lumped into the anxious cluster because we believe that anxiety energizes us, but that's not what they're experiencing. They just think you should do what they tell you to do because it's the right thing to do, and they'll have a good rationale and argument for it. So the groups that I think I'm going to back up, cause leaders particular challenge can be the paranoid, but they're rare. Probably not much this cluster, except you might not know what to do with them just because, wow, these people are different. But the antisocial, definitely. They're the predator types you have to watch. The histrionic because of the drama, the narcissistic because they can become predators, um, but it's just really unpleasant, and so you really have to be careful if you have they can really harm your leadership team if they exist on it. Borderlines are really not going to probably get into leadership. Male borderlines tend to end up in prison, and females getting a lot of challenging attention from leaders. So that, again, that's more the attention and emotional drain that is the problem with that particular condition. Avoidance and dependence, probably not really a problem for you. The obsessive compulsive are likely to be angry and demanding. And they have a rationale for it, but you'll just be sitting there thinking, you're just too rigid. This is just too much. So that's a quick run through of the ones I think that could cause issues. So basic themes. How do we identify this? What can I do to be thinking about this sort of thing? So anytime you have an individual, whether it be a leader, a staff person, or a congruent, or a visitor, or someone who you're ministering to, and you have a pretty well defined context of ministry, a way of doing things, a a manner of, you yourself have a manner of engaging people that usually works pretty well, both in terms of encouragement, gentle correction, that sort of thing. And it's just not working. So no matter how hard you try to do what you know what to do, the other person doesn't change. As soon as you kind of feel that way, begin asking yourself, am I dealing with someone who has a much less likelihood of being able to conform, being able to comply, being able to be reasonable, being able to negotiate? All these things the personality disorder has difficulty doing. So you also see repetitive themes present. I told you the story about the guy that, we got to put this sign up. Here's why we have to put this sign up. This sign will be so meaningful to our community. They just are unrelenting. They don't stop. So in terms of behavior is repetitive, but in terms of even the things they talk about, just kind of repeated over and over and over. And then and then related to this lack of change is rigid adherence. Um, um, and if you get to know them, you'll see it's in their thinking, it's in the way they express themselves, their behaviors, and the impact on relationships as well. And then lastly, it just seems unreasonable. In fact, given what I do, first time I walk away with somebody and I man, that was unreasonable. I've been thinking, okay, why was it unreasonable? Was it me? Was I failing to communicate? And then the more you know yourself, you're able to say, like, I know there are times when my personality type is I speak to in bullets, to not enough detail. Other people need more. I may not quite read the other person unless I'm really paying attention, may give information before they're ready to receive it. So I know that about me. So I can, did I do that? Did I do that? No, I think I did pretty well. Maybe it's them. Maybe it's the other party's unwillingness or incapacity to respond to normal ministry, normal relationship, normal adherence to the roles you have put them in your administration. I'm doing a consultation. I'm most always doing a consultation with someone who has a significant personality disorder in their life. I coached a pastor 20 years ago who had, it was a relatively small church, long history, strong tradition in the community. Um, it was part of a denomination, and um, one third of it were all one family, and they were all like this. And so, after about 2 years of ministry, he was worn to a frazzle. Came and began working with me, and there were some things he needed to learn to become more effective. He needed to be, uh, and I'll talk about this in a minute. He needed to be kind but forceful. He needed to establish a consensus of expectation amongst other leaders in the church. So he had to be strategic in board development and so forth. And he had to be patient. He had to accept the limits of his influence to not just go crazy. And it took about 2 years, but they left, which is often the outcome. Even though they had been founding members several generations back, um, the health of the church was incompatible with the way they did business, and they left. And when he left that church several years later, it was a healthy church, and but it took division to create a healthy church. Now, could those people have grown and developed? Maybe, but they have to be willing to, which was not their case. So sometimes a church split is necessary. Uh, I'm not saying it was strategic. He wasn't trying to drive them out, but as he built a healthy board, they began simply implementing normal church policy. They didn't get distracted by the complaints, the threats. Um, the church got healthier. And he learned a lot, and he later became a consultant to pastors as a result of a variety of life experiences, including the one that he went through there. So, as a leader, as a pastor or a church leader or a business leader, if we successfully identify that someone has, they're just the way they are, they're just not going to easily conform to a healthy role. What do? We have to develop the ability to confront. What we hope for, actually, is that confrontation will lead to conviction. That a person will accept, okay, what I'm doing is not optimally beneficial or even destructive. Um, and so you'll see there's a problem with that. They don't easily perceive that it's their problem, particularly the paranoid, the obsessive compulsive, the narcissistic. If you're a narcissist and you're wonderful, you're right next to God. How could I possibly have any flaws? If you're an obsessive compulsive person and you're adhering to your rules, which you believe are the right way to live, how could you possibly be at fault? You're adhering to every rule rigidly. And I've seen such suffering in families with this. Um, the same individual that I referenced that was one of my family was a leader, was a pastor, and rules were inviolate. So I heard this story from the one of the nuclear family members that he was speaking. He was an evangelist. He was speaking at a particular church. They'd been a week at this church, and the last meeting was late Sunday evening. So they departed from that meeting, and they were to drive home that night, which was 3-4 hours away. Well, they get out about 9 o'clock. Gas stations are open, but it's the Sabbath. I don't mean to offend anybody. You may have done the same thing, but I thought it was unreasonable. He had small children in the car. So the wife and the 3 sons, all of whom were under the age of 15, sat in the vehicle at the gas station until midnight. And then they pumped gas and they went on down their way. So I would say that adherence to the law in that case was unkind. And that is the memory of some of the family, 2 of whom became pastors. But those memories were not positive, growing up as children. So we hope that confrontation, gentle confrontation, telling the truth would lead to conviction. It often does not. So we hope also it would bring not only to conviction, but to repentance, so they would turn from, change the way they think and believe. Again, the rigidity makes it difficult, and we would ultimately then hope for character change, which is possible. But more common is redirection, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. It's more likely that you can, or God can, with your involvement, redirect somebody than actually change them. And if they decide to change, they need constant feedback. So I've had men, mostly men, come to me, women too, I give them to Becky these days. So men come to me and they've learned they're smart. And I don't have sufficient empathy, and it's harming my family. Now these people have experienced enough suffering to be willing to admit, and they value their family. They really do. They value their family. They value their role in the church, and they realize that their way of doing things hurts people. So we go through some pretty significant work. It's often a couple of years, and it isn't so much that they have to learn their way of processing empathy. You know, you've heard me say as we were talking personality, I'm a thinker, less a feeler. And so I process other people's emotions through an analytical thinking process, sometimes feeling myself. Whereas my wife, Becky, who is a feeler, feels with the person, just different ways of doing it. And everybody can improve in any particular skill, including empathy, but they have to figure out their way to do it. So the highly motivated person will be convicted, usually not after the first confrontation, usually after, like most of the people I've worked with, it's either losing a lot or the threat of losing a lot, often family, position, sometimes employment. And it's a process to bring them to change. Now now I'm a mental health provider, so my role is like providing the therapy and stuff like that. The role of the church leader is providing support. And I love what we do because we have such a relationship with churches, so we can work together strategizing what kinds of experiences could be really healing and growth promoting. And where should a person be given responsibility? Where should they not? Many people really, to change, need to step out of any leadership role for a season, because they keep lapsing into their old ways of doing things. So there's just a variety of things that can come into play to help people who are motivated grow and develop. But statistically, the number of people motivated to change is very low, very low. Just statistically, not speaking outside of what God could do. So if you are a leader and you feel that you have or are or might deal with someone who thinks differently than other people, behaves differently than other people, doesn't seem to want to respond to normal correction, normal direction, you have to make sure you don't stand alone. When most of the early, a while back, it was usually pastors who they just were not connected in a social way to where they were getting enough help with their own thoughts and feelings. So they were feeling kind of incompetent, actually, to deal with some of this stuff. So when you begin identifying this, and you're a senior leader, you utilize your team. You talk about these things, not in a gossip way. Good boundaries, but we have to talk about this person, this family, these circumstances. And so you have church policy, or if you're a business leader, you have handbooks, you have corporate, and so you just make sure you follow it. And here's what happens: the emotional appeal, or the demandingness, is so intense that we begin to make exceptions for them. And the more you do that, the more you make exceptions, the worse it gets. It's like they'll fill as much space as you give them. So this, what is our church policy? We get together, whatever your leadership consists of, elders, deacons, board members, if you have outside authority to bring in, you talk about it. What do we have? How do we do this? So nobody stands alone. The greatest buffer against the negative effects of stress is social support. It's not standing alone. By the way, Mirabella came. Thank you. You'll see a chat button, and now that Mirabella's here, she can monitor questions. If you have a question or comment you want to address during this session, you can use your chat button and put it in there. So don't stand alone, and follow church policy and discipline. Do not make exceptions, or as little as possible. This is a place where you see. The thing is, certain individuals are so sensitive to injustice, their perception of injustice, that when you think you're helping by treating them differently, it'll blow up. It'll come right and backfire. It'll be a real problem. So when you're able to say, this is how we handle this situation, and you do it, then we have some people who are very litigious. They'll sue, and as long as you're following church policy, and also documenting that you are, and the collective of leadership is on board, you've sought whatever outside consultation you need to, you'll be fine. You'll be absolutely fine. So the other thing is, along the lines of don't stand alone, know what your policies are, implement them, is firmness. And what I teach everybody is, when other parties, someone is coming to me, they're getting excited, the timbre is rising, They're getting louder, they're getting faster. We go lower and slower. And, and so there's a calm confidence that is presented while you respond to the emotional onslaught or the argumentative onslaught or whatever it is. So when they go faster and higher, we go lower and slower. I literally lower my voice. I slow down the pace of my speaking. And it's not to be menacing. It's actually to be calming. And it's just, so it's the opposite. And there's a technique called broken record where you repeat the same thing. So someone is being unreasonable and you say, this is our policy. This is what we expect. They come back with another argument. And so it's actually, when you realize that what is I'm describing is happening, fewer words, the same words, unemotional, calm presentation of the facts, broken record. So I need you to, and so I do this in the conversation, I will. So this happens to me every now and then. I get a phone call, I pick it up. There's an angry somebody on the other side. They're just yelling into the phone. And I will go lower and slower and I'll say, I need you to slow down. They're very specific. So you're using, I think it's another slide I've got, using descriptive language, not judgmental. So I don't say back, you're being a jerk, knock it off. It's you're speaking too loud, you're speaking too fast, and I perceive that we're not going to get anywhere like this. So what I would like you to do is lower your tone, slow down, stop cursing, and we can continue this conversation. 3 out of 4 times they don't change. So they keep doing what they're doing. I will repeat it. Broken record, same thing. I need you to slow down. I need you to talk softer. I need you to stop cursing, or I'm going to end this conversation. The third time, so it's 3 strikes and you're out. The third time, you have not lowered your voice. You have not stopped cursing. You have not slowed down your rate of speech. I'm going to end this conversation when you can talk to me and you lower your voice, you slow down, and you don't curse. We can continue this conversation. I'm hanging up now. Click. So it is being kind. It is being truthful. I'm describing what's happening. I'm stating what needs to happen. I am calm. I'm confident. I've done this a lot. But then I follow through. This is what I'm going to do. Click. I have, as I said, I've probably ended 75% of the conversations from people who, in my opinion, are being unreasonable, treating me disrespectfully, acting in a manner that is actually disrespecting them. So I don't want them to behave in ways that they should be ashamed of. And so I do what I can to limit the duration and the frequency and the intensity of those conversations. I do what I can do. I'm not responsible for them. And that's a mentality that we have to develop. I am not responsible for the misbehavior of others as long as I'm behaving myself. So don't stand alone. Follow church policy and discipline. Stay firm and learn to communicate to maintain boundaries. And broken record is one of the techniques that is very effective. It helps with that. So what is excellent communication in the face of adversity? And so we developed this quite a bit in the first 2 sessions of the Lead Like Jesus series, which are available in auditory form with slides, if you want to review that. And so we have one can be kind and firm. Lori Beth Jones wrote a really good book, Teach Them to Fish. I'd recommend it. Take your team through this book. It's really good. And so one of the chapters is Jesus was kind, but he wasn't always nice. And so she defines these terms. Nice, says Lori Beth Jones, is that people get what they want. If you give people what they want, they think you're nice. They like you. But you can deliver kindly truth that they don't want to hear. So for me, the kindness is tone of voice. It's the kind of language we use. We don't use judgmental language. We've learned not to say things that are not true because they'll catch you every time and they'll accuse you of all kinds of things. So very, very factual messages, very, very calmly stated. So we're kind. Set limits on Excel behavior. Okay, so I have a relationship with a church that had a registered sex offender begin coming to their church. And they wisely consulted with their church attorney and with me. Wouldn't have had to been me, it happened to be me. And so it was pretty easy to put together policy so that they could be in fellowship with someone who was a known sex offender, and I believe who claimed innocence. So this was another thing. So there are times when people will come to you as a Christian leader and expect you to treat them different because you're a Christian, as if you will treat me justly when all the world has treated me unjustly. So it's not our job to figure out, was this person guilty or not? The state had found him guilty. He was a registered sex offender. His accusation had to do with minors. So the dilemma was, how can somebody be in fellowship and deal with minors? And so they came up with a reasonable plan. This individual would not be on church property, except under certain circumstances. They assigned an elder that he would be accountable to, and who was willing to provide information. You can come to this event. There will be no children. And the services were all online, so he could participate, and he could participate in an adult small group which would meet weekly. So he could have weekly fellowship, weekly teaching, periodic presence on site. Well, it wouldn't be very often, and he could be a participant in the church. And as you can suspect, he refused. He accused them of not being merciful, not being gracious, not being Christian. And so their problem was solved because he went away. It's not their job to keep him or to change him. It's their job to give him an opportunity. This is an important thought. I give you an opportunity to grow, an opportunity to fellowship, an opportunity to learn. You don't have to take it. And so the person leaves. Accept the limits of your influence, which I kind of talked about just now. Not only can't you keep everybody happy, you shouldn't keep everybody happy, because what makes some people happy is bad. And so we have to accept that sometimes people will be unhappy with you. We have to keep our role in place as shepherds. The safety of the flock is very important, as in the story of the convicted sex offender. And I've already told the watch your wallet story. Sometimes you just have to set rigid boundaries, and you really have to be wary because you know what could happen. So you watch your wallet, or metaphorically, whatever that is. And so this is what comprises excellent communication in the face of someone who is unreasonable. Non-judgmental comments, shoulds, oughts, and musts, I don't use with people unless I am enforcing a rule. In order to do this, you must do that. So it fits there. But in terms of their behavior, you shouldn't have done this. There's just certain language that is triggering. And so we observe and describe. I observed that you inappropriately spoke to this young lady on this occasion. Or we have another witness who is willing to testify. This witness has said that you inappropriately spoke to this young lady. So it's very objective. It's very descriptive. And then we do make judgment. That's unacceptable. And then we talk about what corrective action there could be. So you have to be really careful that you aren't triggered into being overly reactive yourself, that you don't become exaggerated in your expression, or you don't fall into emotional expressions. We talk about this in previous training. Rational expressions are descriptive. Emotional expressions are often exaggerated because they're communicating a feeling. And so if I get mad, I will say things that I shouldn't say, guaranteed. And so I have to watch that. I have to know enough about me to be able to remain calm and objective in the face of unreasonable communication. Always corroborate stories with eyewitnesses. There will always be conflict. So articulate, intelligent people with disorders of personality will state a great argument. It's just not true. And so this happens a lot in marriages. Pastors called into a marriage consultation. This person says this person says the exact opposite. I'm not God. What is it? You gather what information you can. And so with marriages, I'll interview other families. I will, talk to friends and family, and usually the truth comes out. Who is telling the truth, if anybody is, and only then can you really know what to do when you have the true story. So what does conversion do? To be converted, behold, all things are become new, and yet Paul writes that the flesh still battles with the spirit, and it doesn't. We're not all made the same after conversion. So examples of people who were redeemed and redirected, but maybe not changed in the way you might be thinking about it. The conversion of Saul to Paul, a zealot, a willing to kill for the faith, out there. Both guys. Paul was also willing to die for the faith, out there, willing to go to the ends of the earth. So you see this, God takes And I would say that Saul probably had some what we would call disorders of character. Probably obsessive compulsive, maybe a little narcissistic, maybe a little antisocial, and high sensation seeking. And so, but redirected. Brother Andrew, if you know this story, if you read his book, he starts out in World War II as a youth throwing bricks off the roofs at Nazi soldiers. Pretty risky stuff. And so, angry, expressive, and he becomes one who takes Bibles. So high sensation seeking, again, that God redirects. If you're familiar with Nicky Cruz, The Sword and the Switchblade, David Wilkerson, a number of decades ago, he tells his story. And great conversion in terms of redirection. So that's how I tend to think of most people who have either exceptional talent, exceptional intelligence, or exceptional rigidity, exceptional something that isn't always positive but can be, is God redirects. So that helps me not be judgmental. I have optimism and hope when people have a long track record of really doing a lot of damage in circumstances. I believe God can convert and redirect. So we're winding up here. Let me check on questions real quick. Don't see any. Thank you for hanging in there with me. APA.org is the American Psychological Association. These are secular resources. And you can, in the search bar, key in any of these terms. Very useful. Sometimes they'll say if they're studies, you can actually read studies, but some really nice consumer bulletins, handouts, 1 page, 3 page, 5 page, really, really useful. National Institute of Mental Health, that's NIMH.gov, same thing. Content for professionals, such as most of you, and laity or congregants, consumer handouts. We have our past trainings and EdenLeaders.com we're building content into. And so hopefully very soon you'll be able to have access to all of our trainings on that site. Right now, if you go to EdenCounseling.com, they're under resources, under media, you'll see some of the old trainings. We're going to eventually migrate those over to the new site. So these are things you can use. I want you to, the web has wonderful resources, but also some nonsense. So I want to give you sources that are reliable, okay? So you're going to get a survey, and in your email today, please fill it out. Attend to what, topics that might interest you in terms of, what I teach when it's me is some mix of biblical and church traditions and science, focusing a lot on relationship, a lot on and issues pertaining to that, motivation and that sort of thing. I haven't decided what I will do in November yet. We'll announce that soon, and I'm inclined to kind of continue a series with kind of stemming from Lead Like the Good Shepherd. So it's likely to have content from John 10 in it. So thank you for joining us. You're all great for hanging in there, and I hope to see you again. Please do fill out the survey. God bless. Take care.